Well, that's a really complicated question. Firsts in video games have always been nebulous. Even the seemingly more simple question of what the first video game was, period, is hotly disputed. I would say Stray Keys Drots from 1951, but that's beside the point. What is more certain is that when it comes to the first 3D video game, you, yes you, are wrong. First is the problem of semantics. What does 3D even mean in this context? Is this 3D? Is this 3D? Is this even really 3D? As you might anticipate from the channel's title, the answer, at least for our purposes, is no to all three. We're going to be defining a 3D video game as any game taking place in a general-purpose 3D engine. This means that, given enough processing power, any view can be created with it. You can make an object of any shape, and you can rotate the camera any which way you like around that object. This disqualifies the previous games because, despite showing the player a 3D space, each engine is specially designed to show one particular viewpoint of one particular environment. Be that a 90-degree angle of a square tunnel, an over-the-shoulder view of a road, or even a smoothly rotating view of a 3D space where you can't look up or down. Just wanted to squeeze in and say that the reason Doom isn't 3D is because it takes a top-down 2D image in gameplay and it renders it in first person using a technique called raycasting. And I know, you're saying this is 3D, but this isn't? Yes, exactly. This general-purpose 3D is most often created with polygons, which are usually triangular. They consist of 3 vector points defined by their x, y, and z positions, linked together in space. These units, these days measured in millions per frame, are the atoms which build up an entire 3D scene. So now that we've established a baseline, what are the earliest games that come to mind? For many, it's the textured views of Mario 64 or Ridge Racer. Others may go back a few years to the flat-shaded polygons of Star Fox or Virtua Racing. And a particularly nerdy subset of people who dare to recall a time before the NES will of course point all the way back to wireframe games of the early 80s, such as Battlezone and Elite. As is so often the case, though, in video game history, the real answer is neither recognizable nor fun to play. The real answer is Space Sim. Probably, as far as we know. Space Sim is a 32-player simultaneous polygonal 3D space combat game released in March of 1974. A sentence which sounds completely absurd to anyone who hasn't heard of the Plato computer system, which may as well be everyone on Earth. That's a story for its own video, but suffice to say, Plato was the 1960s equivalent of the internet, with real-time chat rooms, forums, and even online games, all made possible through the magic of hooking up over 1,000 terminals to a supercomputer in Illinois. By 1972, these terminals and that supercomputer had become advanced enough to display high-resolution graphics, and nerds across the University of Illinois promptly got to work inventing multiple new game genres instead of studying for exams. One of those games, of course, was 1974's Space Sim, creating the single-celled organism which would one day evolve into behemoths like Elite Dangerous and EVE Online. Its rendering of 3D space is about as primitive as possible. It drew only the connecting lines from point to point in space, known as a wireframe, with no shading of the surfaces themselves. This game couldn't even hide polygons behind other polygons, known as culling, making the visuals transparent and hard to parse for the viewer. Even then, it did all this at a maximum of 1 frame per second, blanking the screen in between each one. But due to using a polygonal engine at all, you could theoretically place any shape into it, and view that shape from any angle, so here we are. As of March 2024, 3D gaming will be 50 years old. Now, Jim Bowery was not the first person to make a 3D engine on a computer. The history of computing is one of rapidly falling costs, with general-purpose computers going from $6 million military installations at the end of World War II to as little as $2,400 personal devices by the time of Space Sim only 19 years later, both adjusted for inflation. This is all to say that video games were at the bottom of the priority list for decades, and so the earliest history of 3D rendering was actually a joint venture of academia and industry. The depths of computer history become exponentially murkier the closer you get to World War II. And so, to the best of my knowledge, the earliest drawing of a 3D object directly by a computer is a design for the Boeing 737 onto plotter paper in 1960. This comes from my interpretation of the recollection of Norman Sanders, the Boeing engineer who wrote the software, so your mileage may vary. The first real-time 3D rendering for which we have video proof is this cube, made in the CAD software Sketchpad 3, demonstrated in 1963 by its creator, Ivan Sutherland. Seeing him modify a 3D model with 4 different camera angles, at a time when TV was still largely broadcast in black and white, it's just incredible. It really places into perspective just how long technology is often around before it trickles down into accessibility for people like you and I. At this point, I can admit that we've strayed a bit from the question at hand. In fairness, that's because we answered it already, and you just kinda stuck around after class to hang out, which I appreciate. But there is so much more to explore in the depths of 3D game history, so I hope you'll stick around.